and welcome to another Rant Rave review. It is still Get Caught Reading Month, so I will still be reviewing true crime books and showing off random true crime swag, such as my amazing bilingual police and fire tape, because you never know when you might need a bilingual crime scene tape. Anyway, don't ask where I got it. Anyway, so FBI profilers and their books. So, you've probably all heard of this man, or at least heard about Mindhunter. They made a show on Netflix loosely based on this, which I'll get to my opinions on that in a sec. And then there's also Gregg O. McCrary, who no one ever talks about, but he was basically a generation in FBI time, like after John Douglas. They knew each other. And I actually read this first before I'd ever heard of John Douglas or Mindhunter or anything. It was a discard from my library, which is the story of my life. I read a lot of discards from the library. It is The Unknown Darkness, Profiling the Predators Among Us. A former FBI profiler examines his most fascinating and haunting cases. And they are haunting. Like, the thing about reading books by... So there's, like, many different types of people who write crime. There's people who are, investigative reporters or just authors or academics. And then there's actual people who've, like, work in law enforcement. Cops, detectives, FBI profilers, and they do not pull their punches. Like, holy cow. He describes, like, the, like, literal bloody details. He just describes everything. So this is, like, a huge trigger warning. Like, if you're, like, creeped out by, like, rape or anything, like, don't read it. Don't do it. Even though it's really interesting. One of the ones he describes is the Scarsborough rapist, which I'd never heard of, which was the name that they gave the guy who would eventually be dubbed the Ken of the Ken and Barbie killers, which many people have heard of. Horrible. Like, and it's interesting too because he talks about like that escalation of like sexual assault into like full on like savage murder. He talks about how they profile. He talks about the Buddhist temple massacre, which I believe actually happened in Arizona, if I'm not incorrect. He even talks about how he was brought in to consult on a civil case related to the murder that the Fugitive show from the 1960s is based on, which is like, what the heck? It's really interesting. So I highly recommend it. It's just, they are really interesting, fascinating cases. So yay. Gregg O. McCrary. He needs some more love. Everyone knows about John Douglas, and no one knows about this poor man, but he's cool. All right. But John Douglas is also cool. So he's like the guy. So I only have 3 of his books. I have Mindhunter, Inside the FBI's Elite Serial Crime Unit, Cases That Haunt Us, From Jack the Ripper to John Benet Ramsey, the FBI's legendary Mindhunter sheds light on the mysteries that won't go away, and The Anatomy of Motive. The FBI's legendary Mindhunter explores the keys to understanding and catching violent criminals. He also has, golly gosh, there's one that's called Law and Disorder, and then there's one other one that I don't know the name of. He also writes with Mark Olshaker, who also needs a lot of love. Mark Olshaker is his like co-writer on all of his books, and they're really well written. So I'm like 98% sure that's the dude who's responsible for them being that good. If you don't know who this guy is or what the heck Mindhunter is, basically FBI profiling is where you have an unsub who's an unknown subject who has done some crime, and you don't know who he is. So you basically build a profile based on the psychology of the crime, the victimology, how it was perpetrated. All the different little details of the crime to basically figure out, like, okay, like, if this is the crime, why was it committed, and therefore, like, then who committed it? And it's kind of crazy. Like, they can pinpoint, like, race, age, gender, like, all this stuff, like, even, like, job, like, history. It's kind of, like, crazy. But it's all based on psychology. There was even one where it was, like, a child murderer, and they had the age wrong by 20 years, but that was because the guy was in prison for 20 years. So he literally didn't have a chance to, like, keep going. He was just kept away from his, like, preferred victims. And it was, like, it's really fascinating. Super interesting. They did make a Netflix show, which I have mixed feelings on. The first season's decent. Pretty awesome. Very, very much like what they talk about in the book. Just kind of dramatized. A lot of the stuff that they show the prisoners doing in the prison is stuff that the prisoners told them about doing, or that they heard secondhand. Obviously, that wouldn't be as interesting in a show. But they kind of make the character that is based on him into like kind of a weenie, and this guy doesn't seem like that. Like, I cannot imagine this guy acting as dumb and like pathetic as the guy in the show. I don't know. Also, there's like random like sex scenes for no reason because it's Netflix. And the second season, like, has a really weird take on the Atlanta child murders that I don't think fits into the way he describes it in this book. I was like, really? I don't know. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyway, so the Netflix show you can take with a grain of salt, but the book is really good. You should read it. Huge trigger warnings. Holy cow. Like, but I think it's good to read this kind of stuff, if you're a true crime fan, or if you want to have an opinion about, like, crime and criminology and the way we treat prisoners, because he talks about, in this book specifically, he talks about prison psychologists who don't want to know about the crimes that the prisoners have committed. They're like, oh, I don't need to know about that. It's like, you need to know about that. Like, if you're going to advocate this guy getting out into society, like, you need to know what he did and why. So that's a really good one. What I like about John Douglas is he has very specific little nuggets of, like, this book's about this and this book's about that. So this is just his little memoir, basically, of his time in the FBI. And then we have The Anatomy of Motive, which I really liked. He basically talks about mass murderers. So, and all the different types of mass murderers and what motivates them. So, obviously, we always think about serial killers. We're like, oh, serial killers, they kill lots of people. But they're not the only type. Serial killers kill multiple people, like, in different locations, like, over a span of time. And then you have spree killers who just go, like, I'm going to kill a whole bunch of people, like, in, like, a short amount of time. There's assassin types who are, like, they literally, like, will shoot people, like the Las Vegas shooting assassin types. Bombers who obviously kill lots of people indiscriminately because they don't care who's really going to open that bomb. There's another type that I'm totally forgetting. But yeah, it's really interesting. And he talks about, like, what motivates that, why, and case studies. I really like it because as someone who wants to write a mystery, I was like, I need to know these things. It's very important to me to get it right. Arsonists. He also talks about arsonists. So, this one. The Cases That Haunt Us. This one's also really good. It's about either unsolved crimes or unsolved crimes. So some of them are actually unsolved. So JonBenet Ramsey, Jack the Ripper, like, we don't really know, or the Zodiac Killer, we don't know who did those things. And he basically says, okay, based on, like, if I was called in as a profiler on these cases, based on the crime and the victimology, like, here's how I would say this is probably who did it. Like, not who individually, but, like, this is the type of person that they would be. And he even discusses, like, Jack the Ripper, there's all these different theories, and he's like, here's the ones that fit, and here's the ones that don't fit. Which I found really fascinating. I was like, oh, like, that's pretty cool. However, he also discusses cases that are unsolved, like Lizzie Borden, where it's like, we know what happened. But it's interesting. He's like, okay, like, based on this, here's how we know what actually happened. That was cool. The other one that I don't have, but it's really good, and it's actually the first one of his that I read, it's called Law and Disorder. And that one is about miscarriages of justice. And that's the one that I'm going to mostly rave about because it's so good. So it's about miscarriages of justice throughout time. And some of them are, for example, like back in like the 1930s and 20s, and police would just, beat confessions out of people, whether or not that they were actually, guilty. Like, obviously, there's a miscarriage of justice, but he also discusses, is it the Memphis Three? There were these three teenagers during the whole Satanic Panic who were completely thrown under the bus, basically because they were kind of like gothy and edgy, and one of them was probably like had like mental like problems, and they were completely thrown under the bus and convicted of murdering these like little kids, and they had nothing to do with it. And they never actually, well, I won't spoil it. You should read it. It's so good. It's a really long part of the book, but it's so good. So he talks about false convictions. He talks about, tampered confessions, but he also talks about when you know the person did the murder, like you catch them red-handed and you know they did the murder and you have all the evidence and you convict them and they get the death penalty and then they just sit on death row forever and never get executed. And he talks about like what the families have to go through and how it's like, it's so funny too because he's like, I'm not going to tell you if I'm for or against the death penalty. And it's like, I'm pretty sure you're for it, dude. Like, otherwise you would not have picked these crimes. But anyway, but he basically says like, get rid of the death penalty or keep it. But if you're going to keep it, you have to use it. You can't, oh my gosh. He describes this one case of this guy who hideously, again, like I can't even describe it. And if I was going to suggest this book to people, I'd probably suggest they skip that chapter. Like, it's so horrible, like the way this guy murdered this woman because he was mad at his wife, by the way. He didn't even care about this woman. He was mad at his wife, so he like found this woman walking and like murdered her hideously. And was caught literally like hours afterwards and admitted to like killing her, but like was like, oh, this part was an accident. And it's like, no, it wasn't. Like, oh my gosh. So he admitted to doing it and like 100% we know he did it. And then he sat on death row, like he was convicted and sentenced to death, and then sat on death row for longer than that woman who was the victim had ever been alive, which is like not justice. And I totally agree with like what's his name? John Douglas of like, if you think that we shouldn't execute people, then don't put them on death row. But if you do think we should execute people, execute them. Like, do not just have the family constantly have to wait and like agonize and have a million appeals and yeah, like, ugh. And then there was another crime where, oh my gosh, it was a hate crime for, again, like I'm not going to go into the horrible details, but these 3 white guys had like hideously tortured this black guy, and on the witness stand, like one idiot decided to like defend himself and was like, I'd do it again. And it's like, okay, then like we know there's no like appeal process there. There's no like, did he or didn't he? It's like, no, we know that he did this and he wanted to and he would literally do it again. So yeah, I do think like that's just a good book anyway. It's just super fascinating. Like all the different cases are super fascinating. But I think if you're at all interested in the criminal justice system, specifically with like sentencing criminals, like it's like a must read because it's really good. Yeah, I was just like, this is like 10 out of 10, very cool, very interesting. Yeah, so those are my raves for all of them. They're all great, all the John Douglas books, and also Gregg O. McCrary, FBI Profilers, but only read them if you have like a really strong like ability to handle like utter depravity, because these guys have seen some stuff. Anywho, there we go. All right, see you next time.